What if the first gods humanity ever worshipped were not guardians of all, but something humanity learned to fear? Beneath the ziggurats of ancient Sumer, clay tablets whisper a truth that makes the silence uncomfortable. The oldest prayers ever written were not songs of gratitude. They were warnings. Deep in the deserts of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates carve their ancient path through sand the color of rust and bone, fragments of the past still wait. Each cuneiform mark pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago was meant to preserve something vital. Yet now those marks sleep beneath layers of ruin, holding questions no one expected the first civilization to ask. So before the story pulls you too deep, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you're drawn to histories that unsettle rather than comfort. And if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. I want to imagine this unease stretching across the world, shared in the quiet hours when doubt feels most real. The story begins, not with temples but with disillusionment. In the late 19th century, archaeologists working near the ruins of ancient Nippur uncover something unexpected. Clay tablets, thousands of them stacked in temple archives like the fossilized conscience of an entire people. They were catalogued, translated, and filed away in museum basements across Europe. But scholars who studied these texts closely began to notice something that didn't fit the story of ancient devotion. The Sumerians, the people who gave the world its first cities, first writing, first law codes, had left behind religious texts that felt wrong. They didn't read like hymns. They read like complaints. The earliest written records of humanity's relationship with the divine, dating back to 3200 BC, reveal a civilization already questioning the beings they were meant to worship. Temple administrators documented offerings made under obligation, not joy. Scribes recorded divine demands that seemed unfair, punishments that felt too harsh, and silences that bred resentment. Records show that Sumerian priests kept detailed accounts of divine behavior, not to celebrate the gods, but to track them the way someone might record as storms, Hathor floods damage. Inscriptions described gods who argued among themselves, hid knowledge on purpose, and treated humanity not as beloved children, but as necessary workers. It was as if the curtain had lifted on something scholars weren't prepared to see. The first religious civilization on Earth had been deeply, quietly suspicious of its own gods. Historians have long struggled with this conflict. Religion is supposed to change from fear to love, from primitive terror to enlightened faith. But the Sumerians complicate that idea. Their earliest texts already contain philosophical doubt. Their temple hymns carry undercurrents of unease. Their creation myths don't celebrate humanity's birth. They document its purpose as servitude. The clay tablets don't hide this tension. They preserve it. Imagine holding one of those tablets warm in your palm, its wedge-shaped marks still sharp after 5 millennia. Cuneiform, literally wedge-shaped, was not merely an alphabet, but a geometry of preservation. Each triangular impression held both sound and meaning, pressed into clay by hands that lived before every empire we know. Through these marks, Sumerian scribes recorded everything: trade agreements, medical treatments, astronomical observations, legal disputes, and prayers. But they also recorded something else. Doubts etched into administrative logs, laments hidden in ritual texts, questions about divine justice that had no comfortable answers. One tablet from the city of contains a prayer that stops mid-verse to asks why the innocent suffer while the wicked prosper. Another from Lagash questions why the gods demand worship if they already possess everything. A third, found in the temple archives of Eridu, asks a question that still echoes. If the gods are wise, why do they hide knowledge from those who serve them? These aren't the words of a primitive people inventing gods to explain thunder. These are the questions of a civilization that had been watching its gods closely and didn't like what it saw. When archaeologists excavated the Great Ziggurat, they expected to find evidence of blind devotion. Instead, they discovered temple libraries containing thousands of administrative tablets that treated divine commands like bureaucratic orders to be recorded, questioned, and sometimes quietly resisted. The tablets list offerings made, rituals performed, prayers spoken, but the language is clinical, almost resentful. Buried beneath the temple floors, they found something even more unsettling. Texts describing internal debates among the priesthood about whether the gods deserved the loyalty they demanded. These weren't heretical outsiders. These were the temple officials themselves, the ones charged with maintaining divine worship, questioning in writing whether the beings they served were truly benevolent. Inscriptions describe gods who withheld rain not because of human sin, but because of divine whim. Chronologies show that priests track patterns of divine behavior the way we might track weather systems, looking for predictability in forces that seemed fundamentally arbitrary. The Sumerian pantheon itself reveals this tension. Enlil, the king of the gods, is described in texts as powerful but temperamental, capable of destroying humanity over minor irritations. Enki, the god of wisdom, is portrayed as a trickster who gave humans knowledge, specifically because the other gods forbade it. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, is celebrated and feared in equal measure, her worship tinged with the awareness that her favor could turn to wrath without warning. These aren't portraits of kind creators. They're descriptions of powerful beings whose motives stayed unclear and his justice seemed inconsistent. Some scholars argue that this ambivalence reflects the harsh realities of life in ancient Mesopotamia. A land where floods destroyed cities without warning, where droughts brought starvation, where the natural world felt actively hostile. Of course, the gods would be unpredictable. The world itself was unpredictable. But others point to something more intentional in the Sumerian texts. The language isn't passive acceptance of divine mystery. It's active questioning. The priests weren't simply recording chaos. They were documenting a pattern that disturbed them. The Sumerian timeline itself deepens the mystery. By the time their first texts appear around 3200 BC, their religious system is already fully developed and already contains these troubling contradictions. There's no evolution from simple worship to complex doubt. The doubt is there from the beginning, as if the Sumerians had inherited not just civilization, but a wary understanding of the beings who taught them. In the British Museum, a small clay cylinder sits behind protective glass. The inscription on its surface is a prayer to Enlil, but the final lines break from the expected format. Instead of closing with praise, the scribe wrote, "We serve as commanded, but we do not understand the command. We worship as required, but we question the requirements." It's a quiet act of defiance preserved in clay for 5,000 years. Sometimes when you look closely at these tablets, you can still see the fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried. The mark of the scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago. And if you trace those ridges with your eyes, you realize those hands were writing down doubts that their own priests must have carried in silence. The same doubts that would later be called heresy. The same questions that would be forbidden in later religions. But here in humanity's first written records, they were simply recorded. Perhaps that's what makes these texts so unsettling. They suggest that doubt isn't a modern luxury or a failure of ancient faith. Doubt was there from the very beginning, the moment humans gained the ability to write down what they truly thought. The Sumerians didn't invent gods and then question them. Later, they questioned them from the start, and the clay remembers. At night, when the museum lights fade and the galleries fall silent, I imagine those tablets resting in their cases, each one holding a fragment of humanity's first crisis of faith. We think of ancient peoples as certain in their beliefs, untroubled by the philosophical questions that plague modern minds. But maybe we are the ones who forgot how to doubt properly. Maybe we are the ones they turned uncomfortable questions into comfortable myths. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first written question humanity ever dared to ask about its creators. What if they are not what they claim to be? Records show that the Sumerians had a name for this growing unease. They called it the weight of heaven, the burden of serving gods whose true nature remained hidden, whose commands felt increasingly arbitrary, and whose withdrawals suggested something had gone wrong in the divine order itself. But to understand why the Sumerians began to suspect their gods, we must first understand who those gods claimed to be, and what role they insisted humanity was created to serve. The tablets describe them as the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, and what they demanded was not love, it was labor. The Anunnaki were not gods in the way we understand the term today. They did not live in Elba's abstract heavens, handing out blessings from realms beyond mortal understanding. They did not ask for faith in exchange for salvation. They did not promise eternal life or moral redemption. Inscriptions describe them as administrators of earth, present, physical, and unsettlingly bureaucratic in their approach to divinity. The earliest Sumerian texts portrayed the Anunnaki not as creators who loved their creation, but as overseers who required maintenance of their estates. Temple records from Lagash document daily offerings not as acts of devotion, but as contractual obligations. 50 loaves of bread, 3 sheep, 20 jugs of beer. The language is transactional, precise, almost commercial. 1. Administrative tablet from the Temple of Nippur reads, delivered to the house of Enlil is commanded, received by the keeper of accounts. No shortage recorded. This is not prayer. This is a receipt. The relationship between humans and the Anunnaki was built on a foundation of function, not affection. Humans existed to work, to maintain the temples, cultivate the fields, mine the earth, and ensure that the divine infrastructure remained operational. The gods provided structure, knowledge, and order. Humanity provided labor. Texts from the city of Eridu describe the creation of humans in strikingly practical terms. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest Mesopotamian creation stories, humanity is made specifically because the lesser gods had grown tired of the endless work required to maintain the world. They rebelled, refusing to dig canals and harvest fields any longer. The solution was not divine mercy, but divine efficiency. Humans were created to replace the exhausted workers. The Sumerian term used is lulu, literally mixed one or primitive worker. Not beloved, not chosen, mixed from clay and divine essence for a single purpose to serve. The text is explicit. Let man bear the yoke. Let man carry the labor basket of the gods. There is no promise of paradise here. No covenant of love. Just an assignment. What makes this arrangement even more unsettling is how thoroughly the Sumerians documented it. Temple hymns don't disguise the relationship, they formalize it. One hymn to the goddess Inanna describes her temple workers as those who toil so that the goddess may rest. Another text from her catalogs the monthly labor requirements for temple construction, listing human workers alongside livestock and building materials. The Anunnaki themselves are described with a precision that strips away mysticism. Enlil, the chief deity, is called Lord of the Command, not Lord of Love or Lord of Mercy, but the one who gives orders. His temple records read like project management logs, irrigation systems to be expanded, granaries to be filled, tribute to be collected. Enki, the god of wisdom, is portrayed as an engineer. His myths describe him designing the structure of civilization itself, appointing which humans would be farmers, which would be scribes, which would be priests. He parceled out roles and functions the way an architect assigns rooms in a building. Even the gods of fertility and harvest are described in practical terms. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, is celebrated not for maternal warmth, but for her ability to produce resources efficiently. Her titles include Lady of the Storeroom and she who increases abundance, managerial language applied to divinity. The architectural evidence supports this functional relationship. Ziggurats, those massive step pyramids that dominated Sumerian cities, were not gathering places for communal worship. They were administrative centers. The temple at the top housed the god's dwelling, yes, but the lower levels contained granaries, treasuries, workshops, and record-keeping chambers. The ziggurat alone employed hundreds of workers, bakers, brewers, weavers, scribes, and laborers who maintained the structure and prepared the daily offerings. Archaeological excavations revealed that these temple complexes worked more like state enterprises than spiritual sanctuaries. Chronologies indicate that the largest temples collected taxes, administered justice, controlled water rights, and managed trade. The gods weren't distant spiritual guides. They were the government, and governments require obedience. What's missing from these texts is perhaps more revealing than what's present. There are no Sumerian equivalents of God is love or the Lord is my shepherd. There are no promises of divine comfort or eternal peace. The afterlife in Sumerian belief was a shadowy, joyless underworld where all souls went regardless of virtue. Divine favor didn't even extend beyond death. The gods gave laws, techniques, and structure. In exchange, they expected production. It was a trade agreement, written in clay and enforced through ritual. One tablet from the temple archive at Gersu contains a priest's note that still carries weight across 5 millennia. The gods are masters. We are servants. This is the order of things. Not the gods are loving. Not the gods are just. The gods are masters. And if that was truly how humanity's first civilization understood the divine, not as saviors to be loved, but as masters to be served, then the real question becomes, where did they learn such precision? How did the Anunnaki, these master administrators, gain the knowledge they so carefully distributed to humanity? And why did they guard it so jealously? The knowledge the Anunnaki distributed came with a strange characteristic. It was already complete. When archaeologists translated the earliest Sumerian mathematical tablets, they expected to find simple counting systems, perhaps basic addition, simple geometry, the kind of trial and error calculations that civilizations developed slowly over centuries. Instead, they found BASC 60 mathematics. The sexagesimal system, counting in units of 60 rather than 10, appears in Sumerian texts from 3100 BC with no precursor, no simpler version, no evidence of evolution. It is simply there, fully formed and shockingly sophisticated. This is the same system that still controls how we measure time: 60 seconds. In a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees. In a circle. The Sumerians didn't invent this gradually. They recorded it as if they were copying something already known. Mathematical tablets from the city of Shuruppak demonstrate calculations involving square roots, cube roots, and geometric progressions. One tablet solves for the volume of a truncated pyramid using formulas that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Another calculates compound interest across multiple years. But precision that suggests long-established banking practices. There are no practice tablets showing students learning these ideas. No archaeological evidence of mathematical Systems growing from simple to complex. The knowledge appears complete, as if downloaded rather than developed. The astronomical records are even more unsettling. Clay tablets from Babylon and Uruk contain detailed observations of Venus cycles spanning centuries, tracking its movements with an accuracy that requires not just careful watching, but generational record-keeping and mathematical prediction. The tablets list the exact positions of Venus over 583 years, noting its appearances and disappearances with a precision modern astronomers have verified. How does a civilization barely 300 years old possess 500 years of accumulated data? Other tablets track Jupiter's motion through the zodiac, calculating its position decades in advance using techniques that wouldn't resurface until Babylonian astronomers 2,000 years later independently developed similar methods. The Sumerians somehow knew that Jupiter's orbital period was about 12 years, that Saturn took 29 years to circle the Sun, that Mars followed a strange retrograde pattern. They mapped constellations. They tracked lunar eclipses. They understood the precession of equinoxes, a phenomenon so subtle it requires observation spanning centuries to detect. Inscriptions describe the heavens not with mythological wonder, but with bureaucratic precision. Star charts were treated like administrative documents, filed alongside grain inventories and labor logs. The cosmos was another system to be measured, recorded, and managed. Medical texts reveal similar sophistication. Tablets from Nippur describe surgical procedures with specific instructions. Which cuts to make, which herbs to apply, which prayers to recite during treatment. They list symptoms and diagnoses for hundreds of conditions, organizing diseases by affected body parts in a classification system that wouldn't be formalized in the West for millennia. One diagnostic text identifies jaundice by noticing yellowing of the eyes and skin, then prescribes treatments targeting liver function. Another describes symptoms consistent with diabetes, including extreme thirst and frequent urination. These aren't lucky guesses. They reflect systematic observation and accumulated medical knowledge. Legal codes show equal complexity. The earliest law tablets don't contain simple tribal rules. They present detailed legal principles covering property rights, contract law, inheritance disputes, and criminal justice. The Code of Urnamu, dating to around 2100 BC, distinguishes between planned murder and accidental killing, assigns monetary compensation for specific injuries, and establishes protocols for legal testimony. The laws aren't crude, they're refined. Engineering achievements tell the same story. The irrigation systems that transformed Mesopotamian agriculture weren't simple ditches. There were sophisticated networks of canals, reservoirs, and water gates that required precise surveying, hydraulic understanding, and coordinated labor. The city of Uruk covered over 2 square miles by 2900 BC, with streets laid out in geometric patterns, drainage systems preventing flooding, and defensive walls 6 miles in circumference. The ziggurat rises in 3 massive tiers, each level perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions. Its core structure has endured 4,000 years of weather, war, and neglect, a testament to engineering knowledge that understood stress distribution, foundation stability, and material durability. No prototypes exist, no failed experiments, no archaeological evidence of simpler versions leading to these achievements. Chronologies indicate that Sumerian civilization appears around 3500 BC with urban planning, monumental architecture, and complex irrigation already in place. There's no progression from villages to towns to cities. The cities appear first, fully planned and functionally organized. Scholars call this the Sumerian problem. Civilizations are supposed to grow gradually. Technology develops through generations of improvement. Knowledge accumulates slowly, built on centuries of observation and experimentation. That's how human progress works. But the Sumerians break that pattern. Their knowledge doesn't emerge from darkness. It appears already illuminated, as if someone had simply turned on a light. Some researchers argue that earlier settlements must have existed, their remains lost to flooding or erosion. Perhaps the Sumerians developed elsewhere, then migrated to Mesopotamia, bringing established knowledge with them. Perhaps centuries of oral tradition preserved techniques until writing finally recorded them. But if that's true, where did they come from? And why does no archaeological evidence support this migration? Why do their own texts claim knowledge was given rather than discovered? The tablets don't describe learning. They describe receiving. The Anunnaki, according to Sumerian records, brought the me, a concept with no direct translation, but roughly meaning divine powers or fundamental principles of civilization. These me included not just abstract ideas like justice and kingship, but concrete knowledge: mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, writing itself. One text describes the god Enki possessing over 100 me, distributing them selectively to cities and rulers. Knowledge wasn't discovered through human effort. It was handed out by divine authority and then, according to those same texts, carefully controlled. If the Sumerians truly inherited their knowledge rather than developing it, one question becomes unavoidable. What happens to a civilization that has advanced knowledge without understanding how to create it? What happens when technique replaces understanding? Writing itself was not considered a human invention. The Sumerians believed it belonged to the gods, a sacred technology granted under strict conditions and never meant to spread freely. Literacy was power, and power in ancient Sumer was carefully rationed. Only a fraction of the population could read and write. Scribes underwent years of rigorous training in temple schools, copying the same texts repeatedly until their handwriting matched the prescribed forms exactly. These weren't public institutions. They were controlled environments where knowledge was passed on under supervision, with each student bound to the temple that trained them. Texts from the Adaba, the tablet, house or skull, reveal a strict system of information access. Junior scribes learned contracts and accounting. Senior scribes studied medicine and law. Only the highest-ranking priests accessed the astronomical tablets and mythological texts that contain what the Sumerians called deep knowledge. One training tablet warned students clearly, the secrets of the craft are not for the careless mouth. The signs hold power. Use them wrongly and the power turns against you. This wasn't metaphor. This was policy. At the center of this tension stood Enki, the god whose mythological role remains deeply contradictory. Texts describe him as both patron of wisdom and master of deception, the deity who gave humanity knowledge and was punished for it. The myth of Enki and Inma portrays him creating humans against the wishes of other gods, mixing clay with divine essence to fashion workers who could think, reason, and learn. But inscriptions suggest this act was controversial. Enlil, the chief god, reportedly objected, not because humans shouldn't exist, but because they were made too capable, too close to the divine. Another text, the Adapa myth, describes Enki teaching a human named Adapa wisdom so profound that when Adapa appeared before the sky god Anu, Anu reacted with alarm. Who gave this mortal understanding? Who showed him the way of heaven and earth? The implication is clear. Humans weren't supposed to know that much. Enki's response in the text is telling. He doesn't deny teaching Adapa. Instead, he warns the human to refuse the bread and water of immortality that Anu will offer, claiming they're poisoned. Anu offers them genuinely, meaning to grant Adapa eternal life. Adapa refuses, trusting Enki's warning. The result: humanity gains wisdom but loses immortality. Enki gave knowledge but withheld the final gift. Some scholars interpret this as protection. Others read it as control. Either way, the myth sets a pattern. Knowledge comes with limits, and those limits are enforced by the very beings who hand it out. Divine arguments over human knowledge appear throughout Sumerian literature. The Era and Isham epic describes gods debating whether humans should understand metallurgy, the power to forge weapons that could potentially threaten divine authority. The text reveals division among the Anunnaki. Some believed knowledge would stabilize civilization. Others feared it would destabilize the cosmic order. The compromise, according to the myth, was selective distribution. Certain cities received metalworking knowledge. Others didn't. The gods kept control by making sure no single human population had all the pieces. Knowledge fragmentation is divine strategy. The consequences of unauthorized knowledge appear vividly in Sumerian cautionary tales. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though later Babylonian in its complete form, comes from Sumerian fragments that describe Gilgamesh seeking immortality, the one knowledge clearly reserved for the divine. His quest fails. The message of knowledge remains forever beyond human reach, and pursuing it brings only grief. Another text describes a priest who copied forbidden astronomical predictions and was struck with madness. Whether metaphorical or literal, the story worked as a warning. Certain knowledge carried real danger, not because the gods would punish disobedience, but because the knowledge itself could destabilize the human mind. Texts refer to this as Namim, the forbidden knowledge that existed but was kept sealed. Some tablets and temple archives were marked with warnings not to be opened except by command of the chief priest. These weren't suggestions. They were classifications. Information triage. The most unsettling part of this system is its sophistication. The Sumerians didn't restrict knowledge only out of superstition. They developed an entire philosophy explaining why certain truths should stay hidden. One philosophical text from Nippur asks the question directly. If a man knows the stars, can he still be content with earth? If he understands the gods, can he still obey them? The answer, implied by the text structure, is no. Knowledge breeds independence. Independence breeds defiance. Defiance disrupts order. Therefore, knowledge must be controlled. Enki's legacy, then, is deeply ambiguous. He gave humans the tools to think and the rules that kept them from thinking too freely. He lit the path and placed guards along it. He was both liberator and warden, teacher and deceiver. The Sumerians seemed aware of this duality. The hymns to Enki praise his wisdom while admitting his cunning. They thank him for knowledge while recognizing he set its boundaries. When prayer captures this tension perfectly, Lord Enki, who opened our eyes, teach us to see without looking too far. A request for enlightenment, qualified by fear of what too much light might reveal. But there's another layer to this restricted knowledge, one the Sumerians recorded with increasing unease. If the gods controlled knowledge so carefully, what were they protecting? Themselves or humanity? And if knowledge truly carried such danger, why did the gods risk giving it at all? Unless they needed humans capable of thoughtful purposes. The texts never quite explain, unless labor required not just strength, but understanding. The flood that nearly erased humanity was not divine judgment. It was population control. The Sumerian account of the deluge, recorded centuries before the biblical version, contains a detail that disrupts everything we think we know about ancient catastrophe myths. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives ever written, the gods don't destroy humanity because of wickedness or sin. They destroy it because humans have become too numerous and too loud. The text is explicit. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by the uproar. Enlil heard the clamor and said to the great gods, the noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. Not sin, noise. Not moral corruption, overpopulation. This isn't the language of divine justice. It's the language of system overload. Humanity had grown beyond manageable limits. And the solution was not a former guidance. The solution was elimination and restart. The atrahasis. Epic provides even more unsettling details. Before the flood, the gods tried other measures: first plague, drought, famine. These weren't warnings. They were control mechanisms, methods to reduce human numbers without total destruction. Only when these partial solutions failed did the gods resort to a total reset. Enlil proposes the flood. The other gods agree. The decision is administrative, almost bureaucratic in its coldness. But one god breaks protocol. Enki, the same deity who gave humans knowledge despite divine objections, chooses to intervene again. He warns a man named Isudr, later known as Utnapishtim in Babylonian texts, Noah in Hebrew tradition, to build a boat. The instructions are precise dimensions, materials, waterproofing techniques, provisions for survival. Critically, Enki doesn't warn humanity. He warns one carefully chosen human, specifically instructed, tasked with a single mission: preserve what matters and survive the reset. The flood, according to Sumerian chronology, marks a clear division in their historical records. The Sumerian king list divides rulers into two categories: those who reigned before the flood and those who came after the flood. Reigns before the flood are impossibly long, tens of thousands of years. Reigns after are measured in recognizable human lifespans. Something fundamental changed. Records show that this wasn't merely a Mesopotamian memory. Flood myths appear across dozens of unconnected cultures. The Hindu Matsya Purana, the Greek story of Deucalion, the Chinese tale of Yu. Indigenous American traditions from the Hopi to the Mapuche. The details vary, but the pattern stays consistent: global catastrophe, divine warning. Chosen survivors, preserved knowledge. How do cultures separated by oceans remember the same event? Geological evidence offers partial answers. Core samples from the Persian Gulf reveal layers of sediment suggesting massive flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC, roughly matching the gap in Sumerian settlement records. Other studies point to the Younger Dryas period, about 12,000 years ago, when rapid climate shifts caused catastrophic sea level rise and widespread flooding as glaciers melted. Either scenario supports the possibility that the Sumerians preserved a memory of real catastrophe, not made-up myth, but inherited testimony. But here's where the story deepens. The Sumerian texts don't portray the flood as tragedy. They portray it as necessity. After the deluge, when the waters recede and Isudr makes offerings, the gods respond not with joy at humanity's survival, but with relief that the reset has been managed properly. One text describes Enlil's reaction: how did any man escape? No man was to survive the destruction. Enki admits his intervention. And, remarkably, the other gods accept it, not because they've changed their minds about humanity, but because they realize complete extinction would leave them without workers. The flood wasn't meant to end humanity. It was meant to reduce it to manageable numbers. The survivors weren't chosen for righteousness. They were chosen for usefulness. Isudr is described not as the most moral man, but as exceedingly wise, someone capable of preserving the knowledge systems the gods had established. The book carries not just his family, but seeds, animals, and presumably the clay tablets containing essential records, a backup system for civilization itself. After the flood, inscriptions describe a changed world. Divine kingship is lowered from heaven again, the same phrase used to describe its original establishments. Cities are rebuilt according to the old plans. Agricultural systems are reestablished. Writing continues. Everything resumes. I'll help you rewrite this script in simple, clear English for a 5th grade student. However, I need to point out that this is a very long script that will take considerable time to rewrite completely, while maintaining the exact length and sequence line by line. Let me begin the rewrite. But smaller, quieter, and easier to control. The gods put new rules in place. Humans were given shorter lives to stop too many people from being born. Women were cursed so many babies would die. A group of priestesses was created who could not have children, which meant even fewer babies. These weren't punishments for doing something wrong. There were changes to prevent the world from becoming too crowded again. One Sumerian writing calls these rules Namlu Yulu, which means the fate of humanity, permanent limits built into human life after the flood, to keep everything balanced. So the flood wasn't about right and wrong at all. It was about making things work better. A civilization that had become too big, too noisy, and too hard to manage was made smaller and restarted with stricter rules. The Sumerians wrote this down not as the gods being unfair, but as the gods doing what was necessary, a coldly logical solution to a problem. And perhaps most disturbing, they wrote it without complaining, as if they understood, as if they accepted that this was just how things worked: grow, get too big, reset, start over, a cycle that had maybe happened before. And might happen again. Something changed after the flood. Something the tablets record with quiet worry. The gods stopped talking. Not right away, not all at once, but slowly over many generations. The direct presence described in earlier writings fades from Sumerian records like sound getting quieter in an empty room. Writings from the 3rd dynasty from around 2100 BC show this change very clearly. Earlier inscriptions described gods giving commands directly to kings and priests, actual conversations written down in businesslike language. Later writings describe only dreams, signs, and omens that needed to be figured out. Direct orders became symbolic messages. Dialogue became fortune-telling. One tablet from this time contains a priest's note that still carries weight. The god no longer answers in words. We read his wishes in the flight of birds, in the pattern of oil on water, in the arrangement of stars. We serve as before, but the voice has grown distant. Temple records show this change in their record-keeping. Earlier tablets list offerings made as commanded by Enlil, or according to the instruction of the Nana language, suggesting real-time divine requirements. Later tablets list offerings made according to tradition, or as established in ancient times. The rituals continue, but the living connection has been replaced by doing what was always done. Archaeological evidence supports this change in the texts. Ziggurats built after 2000 BC keep the same architectural forms as earlier buildings, but their inner rooms, previously described as divine living spaces, begin to work mainly as storage and office centers. The gods' rooms remain carefully maintained and supplied with daily offerings, but no texts describe gods living there. The furniture is there, the table is set, no one sits down. Priests continue performing ceremonies whose original purposes have become unclear. One ritual text from Nippur lists 17 steps for a purification ceremony, each described in exact detail, followed by a note: the reason for the 3rd washing is unknown to us. We perform it as the ancestors did, maintenance without understanding. This creates a strange form of religious practice, one built on memory rather than revelation. The Sumerians don't abandon their gods. They maintain elaborate systems of worship for beings who no longer respond. Temples employ thousands. Festivals continue. Offerings flow. But the recipients have gone silent. Later Babylonian texts inheriting Sumerian traditions show priests actively debating why the gods withdrew. Some argued humanity had failed in its duties. Others suggested the gods had grown tired of earthly affairs. Still others proposed that the divine withdrawal was intentional, a test of humanity's ability to function on its own. None of these explanations appear in earlier Sumerian sources. The Sumerians themselves seem to have had no clear answer, only the documented fact of absence. Hymns from this transition period carry a tone of abandonment. One prayer to Enlil asks, "Why have you turned your face away? Why do you no longer hear our cries? We maintain your house. We fill your tables. We speak your praises. Yet silence answers silence." There's no accusation here, no rebellion, just confusion. Timelines show that this divine withdrawal happens at the same time as increasing political instability in Mesopotamia. As the gods grow distant, human rulers take on more authority, justifying their power not through direct divine instruction, but through claims of divine descent or appointment. Kingship becomes hereditary rather than divinely chosen for each ruler. The absence of active gods makes human decision-making necessary. Some scholars interpret this transition as the growing up of civilization humanity, outgrowing the need for divine micromanagement. Others see it as civilizational abandonment, a withdrawal of support that left societies struggling to maintain systems they no longer fully understood. The Sumerian texts themselves suggest a third possibility: the gods didn't leave because they wanted to, or because humanity drove them away. They left because their work was finished. One fragmentary tablet from Eridu contains a phrase that appears in multiple contexts: the foundation is laid. The pattern is set. The way is shown. This language suggests completion, not abandonment, as if the gods had come to establish something, and once established, their continued presence became unnecessary. But if that's true, the question becomes, what were they establishing? A civilization. A knowledge system. A pattern humanity was meant to follow on its own. The texts don't say. They record only the silence that followed, a silence so deep that every later civilization in Mesopotamia spent centuries trying to interpret it, to understand what the absence meant, and whether the gods might someday return. The priests maintained the temples. The rituals continued. The offerings were made. But deep in the archives, the clay tablets quietly document a troubling transformation: religion, shifting from relationship to archaeology, from living practice to careful preservation of inherited forms. The gods had become memories even while their temples still stood. And humanity, for the first time in its recorded history, stood alone with systems it had been given, but never fully taught to understand. The real question wasn't whether the gods had left. It was whether humanity had been prepared for their departure, or whether, like a student abandoned mid-lesson, civilization would slowly forget the purpose behind the knowledge it struggled to maintain. Time distorts what it preserves. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, something subtle but deep had occurred in Mesopotamian storytelling. The same narratives that appeared in early Sumerian texts as straightforward accounts documented events with specific names, dates, and locations began appearing in later versions wrapped in increasingly elaborate metaphor. The tales became symbols. Events became allegories. History became mythology. The process wasn't immediate. It took centuries, but the path is visible in the archaeological record, written in the changing language of successive civilizations that inherited Sumerian traditions: Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, each generation further removed from the original context. Compare two versions of the same story separated by 1,000 years. An early Sumerian tablet from Eridu describes Enki organizing the world with administrative precision. He appointed the brick god to bricks, the grain goddess to grain, the shepherd god to flocks. The language is functional, describing delegation of responsibilities. The later Babylonian version transforms this into cosmic drama. Enki, in his great wisdom, spoke the secret names of power, and from his words arose the spirits of earth and sky, each singing their eternal task. Same event, different telling. The first reads like a management document. The second reads like poetry. The bureaucratic becomes the mystical. This transformation sped up as writing became less common, and oral tradition became dominant again. Literacy rates, never high in ancient Mesopotamia, declined during periods of political instability. Stories once preserved in temple archives began circulating by word of mouth. Oral tradition reshapes everything it touches. Each retelling adds emphasis. Each generation interprets metaphor literally or literal description metaphorically. Details deemed unimportant fade. Dramatic elements get bigger. Characters become archetypes. Specific individuals become representative figures. The god who once issued irrigation orders becomes the lord of sweet waters. The administrator becomes the cosmic force of wisdom itself. Texts from Neo-Assyrian scribes writing around 700 BC reveal awareness of this degradation. One scholar's note survives: the old tablets are fragmented. The language is obscure. We have interpreted as best we can, but the original meaning may be lost. They knew they were working with echoes. In some cases, the transformation is trackable. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, with its practical description of the flood as population control, evolves through Akkadian versions into the Epic of Atrahasis, where divine motivations become more elaborate and moralistic. By the time the story reaches its Babylonian form in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood has acquired layers of philosophical reflection about mortality and meaning that don't appear in the earliest accounts. Each version is true to its time, but progressively distant from the event it describes. Gods themselves undergo this transformation. Enlil, described in early texts as Lord of the Commanded title, suggesting authority and administration, becomes in later traditions Lord of the Storm, associated with thunder, wind, and natural chaos. The bureaucrat becomes the tempest. The shift reflects changing cultural memory. Later civilizations, no longer experiencing direct divine instruction, reinterpreted the gods through natural phenomena they could observe. Since storms were powerful and unpredictable, Enlil must be the storm. Since water sustains life, Enki must be the water itself. Metaphor replaces memory. Astronomical knowledge suffers similar degradation. Early Sumerian tablets record planetary movements with mathematical precision: data points, coordinates, calculations. Later Babylonian astrology transforms these observations into cosmic omens. Venus isn't tracked for calendar purposes, it's watched for signs of divine favor or displeasure. The science becomes superstition, not through ignorance, but through reinterpretation by generations who no longer understood why the observations. mattered originally. Even rituals transform. Temple ceremonies described in early texts as maintenance tasks: clean the god's chamber, prepare the daily bread, change the linens, acquire spiritual significance in later traditions. Cleaning isn't maintenance, it's purification. Bread isn't sustenance, it's sacrifice. The practical becomes the sacred. This process isn't unique to Mesopotamia. It's how human memory works across cultures. We naturally mythologize what we don't fully understand, transforming concrete events into abstract lessons, historical figures into moral examples, specific technologies into magical powers. Arthur's historical warband becomes Camelot. Viking explorers become gods. Ancient astronomical computers become mysterious artifacts of lost civilizations. The pattern repeats because memory passed through generations without written precision smooths away complexity. It preserves the shape of events while losing their substance. Storytellers emphasize what resonates emotionally, discard what seems irrelevant, and fill gaps with imagination. Within 5 generations, eyewitness accounts become legend. Within 10, legend becomes myth. Within 20, myth becomes religion, sacred stories whose historical origins have been completely obscured by the buildup of meaning. The Sumerians themselves seem to have recognized this process. When philosophical texts from Nippur laments, the words of the ancestors grow dim. Each generation adds to the song but loses verses. Soon we will sing loudly but remember nothing. They watched their own history transforming into mythology in real time, and documented their helplessness to stop it. By the time Babylonian priests were copying Sumerian texts in the first millennium BC, they were already working with mythology, interpreting stories whose literal meanings had been lost centuries earlier. They preserved the forms faithfully but could only guess at the functions. Memory had become myth, and myth, however powerful its emotional truth, is a poor vessel for technical knowledge. The absence created a void that humanity struggled to fill. Not a material void. The temples still stood, the granaries remained full, the irrigation systems continued functioning. The void was existential. For the first time since the beginning of recorded history, humanity faced a question it had never needed to ask. What do we do when those who gave us purpose no longer tell us what that purpose is? The psychological impact appears throughout late Sumerian and early Babylonian literature, in ways that are easy to miss unless you're looking for them. Prayers shift from requests for specific help to pleas for any sign of presence. Hymns that once praised divine accomplishments begin questioning divine intentions. One text from Babylon, dated to approximately 1700 BC, contains a prayer that reads less like worship and more like therapy. My God, I do not know why you are angry. I have performed every ritual. I have spoken every word. I have made every offering. Yet you do not answer. Have I sinned? Teach me my fault. Or is there no fault? Do you simply not hear? The psychological term for this is learned helplessness, when an organism continues performing behaviors that no longer produce results, unable to understand why the connection has broken. Humanity kept pressing the button. Nothing happened. And the confusion bred not rebellion, but deeper compliance. Rituals performed more frequently, more elaborately, in the desperate hope that increased effort might restore the response. Temple records from this period show dramatic increases in offerings and festival days. Cities competed to build larger ziggurats, create more elaborate ceremonies, train more priests, not because the gods demanded it. The gods weren't demanding anything anymore, but because activity felt better than acceptance. If we just try harder, perhaps they'll return. But they didn't. Inscriptions reveal priests attempting to reverse engineer divine will from ancient texts. If the gods no longer spoke, perhaps their earlier words contained sufficient guidance. Temple libraries became increasingly important as scholars searched old tablets for precedents, trying to reconstruct divine intention from fragmentary records. This is where theology begins, not as celebration of divine presence, but as interpretation of divine absence. Questions that would have been answered directly in earlier eras now required philosophical frameworks. Scribes developed elaborate interpretive systems for extracting meaning from ambiguous texts. Diviners created complex methods for reading divine will and natural phenomena. If the gods wouldn't speak in words, perhaps they spoke through signs. The problem was that signs require interpretation, and interpretation introduces uncertainty. One divination text lists 17 possible meanings for a single omen: a crack in a liver during a sacrifice. Different schools of interpretation disagreed. Priests argued. Contradictory predictions spread. Where divine instruction had once been clear and direct, humanity now faced a confusion of competing interpretations. The certainty of command had been replaced by the anxiety of interpretation. This uncertainty generated something unexpected: systematic doubt. Early Babylonian wisdom literature texts like Lutlul Bel Nemeki, often called the Babylonian Job, wrestles explicitly with divine injustice and the problem of undeserved suffering. These weren't heretical texts. They were mainstream theology, preserved in temple libraries, copied by official scribes. The questions they pose are devastating. I have looked for help. No one takes my hand. I wept. No one came to my side. I cried aloud. No one heard me. I am righteous, yet I suffer. The wicked prosper. Where is divine justice? Where is divine order? This represents a fundamental shift in religious consciousness. Earlier Sumerian texts occasionally questioned specific divine actions, but they never questioned the system itself. Divine rule was simply the structure of reality. Now that structure was being questioned. Philosophers began proposing frameworks to explain the silence. Some argued the gods were testing humanity's faithfulness absence as a teaching tool. Others suggested humanity had grown too corrupt, driving the gods away through collective failure. Still others proposed that divine and human realms had separated, becoming increasingly incompatible. None of these explanations appears in earlier texts. Their innovations attempts to make sense of a situation that had no precedent in cultural memory. The most psychologically interesting response appears in what scholars call personal piety text documents, suggesting that individuals should cultivate direct relationships with gods through moral behavior, rather than ritual performance. Since the gods no longer responded to offerings and ceremonies, perhaps they desired something else: justice, compassion, humility. One text advises feed the hungry. Give water to the thirsty. Do not oppress the weak. Perhaps then your God will turn his face toward you. This marks the birth of ethical monotheism, the idea that moral behavior matters more than ritual correctness. It emerges not from divine revelation, but from divine silence. When rituals failed to produce results, humans looked for alternative approaches. Theology became increasingly abstract. Gods who had once been described as physical beings with specific locations and concrete needs became cosmic principles, moral forces, abstract powers. This wasn't spiritual evolution, it was adaptive response to absence. If the gods wouldn't appear physically, perhaps they existed metaphysically. The void was being filled with philosophy because reality had stopped providing answers. But beneath the intellectual frameworks, the emotional weight remained. Humanity had been created to serve, taught to labor, organized around divine purpose, and then abandoned without explanation. The psychological aftermath of that abandonment echoes through centuries of Mesopotamian literature. One haunting text from the first millennium BC asks a question that still resonates: if we were made for the gods, and the gods have departed, what are we made for now? The silence offers no answer. And perhaps that's the cruelest aspect of divine withdrawal, not the absence itself, but the lack of closure. No explanation, no farewell, no final instruction. Just rituals that no longer connect, knowledge that no longer makes sense, and a civilization trying desperately to maintain systems whose original purposes have become incomprehensible. The gods left humanity with tools but withdrew the instruction manual. And in the growing darkness of that absence, humanity began asking the questions that would eventually define philosophy itself. Why do we suffer? What is justice? How should we live? What gives existence meaning? Questions born not from curiosity, but from necessity. Questions the gods, in their presence, had never allowed humanity the space to ask. There's a way to read all of this differently, not as a story of abandonment, but as a story of graduation. The Sumerian texts, when viewed as a complete archive rather than isolated fragments, suggest something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about divine-human relationships. The gods didn't leave because humanity failed. They left because their work was complete. Consider the pattern: active instruction, knowledge transfer, establishment of systems, gradual withdrawal, silence. This isn't a path of failure. It's a path of teaching. A teacher doesn't remain in the classroom forever. Once the lesson is taught, the structure established, the principles demonstrated, continued presence becomes interference rather than guidance. Students must eventually apply knowledge independently, or they never truly learn it. The Sumerians may have understood this better than we do. One fragmentary text from Nippur contains a phrase that appears nowhere else in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian literature: we were not made to be kept. We were made to be left. The implications are staggering. If humanity was created not as permanent servants but as temporary students, beings meant to inherit systems and maintain them independently, then the entire narrative shifts. The gods weren't rulers who abandoned their subjects. They were architects who finished the blueprint and stepped away to let the builders work. The flood takes on new meaning in this context: not punishment, not even population control, but a necessary reset when the first attempt failed, when the student misunderstands the lesson so fundamentally that starting over becomes the only option. And afterward, the gods tried again, this time with different parameters, tighter restrictions, clearer boundaries. Shorter lifespans meant less time to develop problematic independence. Controlled knowledge distribution meant no single population could reconstruct too much too quickly. The second attempt succeeded. Humanity maintained the systems. Cities functioned. Agriculture sustained populations. Writing preserved records. The infrastructure remained operational after the gods withdrew. Mission accomplished. But here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. The Sumerians themselves hint that they weren't the first. Chronologies record kingship being lowered from heaven not once, but twice before the flood and after it. Temple texts reference the old cities in ways that suggest cities older than the ones being described. Astronomical tablets contain observations spanning periods longer than Sumerian civilization existed. Archaeological layers reveal something archaeology struggles to explain. Buried beneath Sumerian ruins are older foundations. Beneath those, older still. Each layer separated by evidence of catastrophic flooding or fire. Each rebuilt following similar patterns: urban planning, irrigation, centralized administration. The same structure reconstructed repeatedly. Some researchers interpret these layers as natural cultural evolution, each generation building upon the previous. But the Sumerian texts themselves suggest otherwise. They describe not evolution, but restoration; not innovation, but remembrance. This is the restoration of what was before. That phrase appears in multiple contexts, always in reference to building projects, always implying that what's being constructed already existed in some earlier form. The ziggurat at Eridu is called the house built for the second time. The temple of Enlil at Nippur is described as the place of kingship, founded anew, not founded again. The Sumerians saw themselves as inheritors of a pattern, a civilizational template that predated their own existence. They were maintaining something, not creating it following instructions passed down through catastrophe and time. But from whom? The texts say from the gods. The deeper question is, were the gods themselves following a pattern? Were they too inheritors of a system they maintained and passed forward? One Babylonian philosophical text poses this exact question: who taught the teachers? Who showed the gods the pattern of heaven and earth? From where did the first knowledge come? The text offers no answer, perhaps because none existed, perhaps because the question itself reveals something the Sumerians have begun to suspect: that knowledge isn't created, it's transmitted; that civilization isn't invented, it's inherited; that everything we think of as human progress might actually be recovery of what was known before, built before, achieved before, and lost. The most haunting evidence appears in what the Sumerians chose not to explain. Their mathematical systems, their astronomical knowledge, their architectural techniques. None are presented as discoveries. They're presented as received wisdom, given by the gods who descended from heaven. But where did those gods learn it? The silence surrounding that question suggests the Sumerians either didn't know or weren't meant to ask. Either way, the implication is the same: the chain of knowledge extends backward beyond the visible horizon. The gods taught humanity. Someone or something taught the gods. And perhaps before that, another cycle, another catastrophe, another reset. Civilizations rising, achieving sophistication, facing crisis, collapsing, leaving behind fragments that become the foundation for the next attempt. We think of history as linear progression. The Sumerians thought of it as cyclical return. Modern archaeology increasingly supports the cyclical view. Advanced civilizations appear too early in multiple locations: sophisticated urban planning in the Indus Valley by 2600 BC, megalithic architecture in Malta by 3600 BC, astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe by 9500 BC, each appearing with minimal developmental stages, as if following templates. The same pattern everywhere. The same unsettling question: how did they know? Perhaps they remembered. Not consciously, not completely, but the way survivors of catastrophe carry trauma in their descendants: cellular memory, cultural reflexes, inherited anxiety about floods and famines and systems collapsing. The Sumerians recorded their unease about divine withdrawal not because it was unprecedented, but because somewhere in their collective memory, they recognized a pattern: the gods always leave. The knowledge always fades. The civilization's always full. And the survivors always try to rebuild, following fragments of what was lost. This is what makes the Sumerian archive so profoundly important. They documented the transition. They wrote down what it feels like to inherit advanced knowledge without understanding its origins. They recorded the psychological weight of maintaining systems whose purposes have become obscure. They were us. Or rather, we are them, inheritors of inherited knowledge, maintaining technologies we didn't invent, following cultural patterns we can't fully explain, operating complex systems whose fundamental principles remain mysterious even to experts. We think we understand, but understanding and replication aren't the same. The Sumerians replicated what they were taught. They maintained the systems. They preserved the knowledge. But the texts reveal an undercurrent of uncertainty, a sense that something essential was missing. Not information, but comprehension. Not the what, but the why. Why this mathematical system and not another? Why these astronomical observations? Why this urban structure? Why any of it? The gods gave answers: this is the way. They didn't give reasons: this is why. And when they left, humanity inherited the answers without the reasons, the blueprint without the vision, the tools without the purpose. Which brings us to the final, most unsettling possibility: we're still doing it. We maintain economic systems we don't fully understand. We follow social patterns we can't entirely explain. We preserve traditions whose original meanings have been lost. We teach knowledge we inherited without questioning where it came from or why it works. We are Sumerians maintaining ziggurats, performing rituals, pressing cuneiform into clay, keeping systems operational without understanding the foundational principles. The gods left humanity to stand alone. But did we ever learn to stand? Or are we still leaning on structures built by those who came before, hoping the foundation holds, praying the pattern continues working, even though we've forgotten why it was designed this way in the first place? The greatest tragedy isn't that the gods left. The tragedy is that we forgot why they came. They came to teach, to establish, to show humanity a pattern that could survive catastrophe and be rebuilt after collapse. They came to make us capable of standing alone. And then they left not in anger, not in disappointment, but in completion. Their work was done. The question that haunts these ancient tablets, the question the Sumerians asked in their silent temples as they maintained rituals without response, is the same question we face now that we'll learn the lesson. Or are we simply repeating what we were taught, keeping the pattern alive without understanding it, waiting for the gods to return and tell us what comes next? The clay tablets offer no comfort, only observation, only record, only the testimony of a civilization that stood at the threshold between divine instruction and human autonomy, and wasn't sure it was ready to cross. They documented their uncertainty so that when the next cycle came, and the text suggests they believed it would come, whoever rebuilt from the ruins would at least have a warning. The gods teach. The gods leave. Humanity maintains what it can, loses what it forgets, and eventually faces the same choice the Sumerians faced: stand alone with incomplete knowledge, or full, and hope the pattern survives to be rebuilt again. Perhaps that's the real purpose of these tablets, not to preserve civilization, but to preserve the memory that civilization's full, knowledge fades, and the only way forward is to build again from fragments, hoping this time we'll remember enough to stand a little longer. The cycle continues. The clay remembers. And somewhere in the desert, beneath layers of sand and time, more tablets wait, holding fragments of patterns older still, echoes of cycles we've forgotten completely, warnings we won't recognize until it's too late to heed them. The Sumerians left us their testimony. We're still trying to understand what it means.